this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is Lian Li's O11 Vision Compact. This is a detailed build guide to show you how to build in this case and create this Vision view with a side-mounted all-in-one cooler and Lian Li's Infinity fans, along with a rear connect motherboard and a rear connect GPU as well, for minimum cables and maximum aesthetics. I'm going to show you the various things that you need to know to set up in this case, and I'll put timestamps down below so you can jump to the relevant points, as well as links in the description for other things of interest. First of all, though, I'm going to start by unboxing the case and taking it apart and showing you all the things you need to know about what's included and the steps for doing so. One thing to note immediately is that the glass panel is included as standard in the box, but you'll also have the vented top panel included and pre-installed that we'll need to remove in a second in order to do this build process. Now, this is a very nice case which you can build in with obviously standard motherboards as well. So I'm going to detail some of those points as I go through in case you don't want to use a rear connect motherboard. So don't worry about that. I'm also going to show you the wiring for the front panel connections for the USB ports at the bottom, 3.5mm jack, the power button, and other things. So there's going to be a lot of depth here with the relevant information you need to know. Make sure you use the timestamps if you don't need to know specific points like that, and you can jump to the other relevant things that you might find useful. I want to make it as user-friendly as possible. So I'm going to go into a lot of depth here and highlight some of the nice things about it. This is a really easy case to build in with multiple different options of what you're throwing into it. You can put hard disk drives and SSDs in there, for example. It has a cage at the bottom, but I'm going to remove that later on and not use it. But you do have various different mounting options, so I will show you where they are. You can see it in the bottom left here that you can put 2 SSDs in there, for example, and I'll show you the removal process for that later. At the bottom is a dust tray that can just be pulled out for future cleaning purposes, and obviously keep your case nice and clean. And at the top, there's 2 thumb screws to remove, and then you can pull the top tray off. You will notice there's no dust filter internally here, but you do have perforations in there. So if you want to use a radiator on there instead, I've done a detailed in-depth explainer guide on it, which I'll link to down below, and you can check out the other options available. But to take it apart, we need to remove a lot of screws from the side and from the top. So we're going to remove this top radiator slash fan tray that sits up here by removing the tiny screws along the front edge, along the rear edge, and on the support bracket at the front as well. And this is necessary, obviously, to put the glass into place, and it makes the build process easier because it means that you can access everything when you're going through. So we can just pop that out, and then you'll see from a different angle what that looks like. And there's also this front support bracket here, which has a couple of screws that need to be removed as well, and then you can take that out. You don't have to do this next step if you don't want to, but I'm removing the front glass panel as well. In order to do that, you remove these 2 thumb screws from the inside, and then you have to access the back to get to some other things. So we pop the rear door off by just pulling it towards us and then lifting it up. Again, there's no additional dust panels in there, but there are some nice vented holes. Now, for reference, you can see there's a couple of little feet that stick into the bottom, and it just pushes back in place. So that's how to install it and how to take it off. Fairly straightforward. Now, once we've done that, you'll see there's 3 more screws along the inside rear of these. These are a lot of tiny screws, so take care you don't lose them during this process. Put them aside safely, and then you can pull off the front panel that has the power switch on it. It comes away, and then that gives you access to more screws. You can see this is a bit convoluted to remove that front glass panel, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. I just thought it would be easier to access various points and also to remove the potential for damaging it during the build process. So if you want to do the same, you have to pop that front panel off and then remove those screws. Again, a lot of screws here, but it's important to get them out of the way and then also make sure you don't lose them because they're very small. With that done, the glass just lifts up and then moves out of the way. And obviously you'll have to repeat that process in reverse to put it back later on. At the rear, you can see we have this SSD door tray thing, which covers the cables, but also can be a mounting point for 2 SSDs, which I'll show you in a minute. Behind that, you'll find there are various different areas where you can tie your cables down. These little hooks here, for example, just slot into the case with very easy setup there, and you can angle them in and then put your cables in and loop them in various ways. You'll see there's also a load of Velcro ties, so you can tie cables down, and I'll show you that in a minute. And this can be quite handy in the build there's no plastic cable ties, so you have to make use of those. The radiator tray can be removed once you've unscrewed a thumb screw at the rear, and then you can lift it out. Now it's worth noting you can actually turn this around so you can flip it so you can have it the other way if you want to, and this gives you options. And in the explainer I showed that you can do a push-pull setup in here if you want to, so you can actually mount fans on the rear and a rad and fans on the front. Or you'll need to work out which way round you're going to install the radiator or how you want the setup to be. In this build, I'm not going to do push-pull because I'm trying to keep it simple. So at the rear here, we have the SSD trays and mounting cages for hard disk drives. You can essentially put extra drives in here or remove them entirely just to get them out of the way. So there's a couple of thumb screws that hold them into place. Just unscrew those and then these lift out, and then you can access the back of the case a bit more effectively and get to the various different areas for tying cables down, which you can see are now exposed. Now I personally removed them from the build just to make life easier and so you can see where we're going to tie cables down, but you can use those if you want to. So there's plenty of space for storage, as we'll get to in a minute. If you want to use your traditional 2.5 inch or 3.5 inch drives, you can set those up pretty nicely. And now we've got the case mostly stripped down. You can see it looks pretty bare, but having it like this makes it easier to access all the different things we're going to need to for installing the parts. One thing worth noting is there is an anti-sag bracket here, which you can see is adjustable. There's a thumb screw at the rear, which you can unscrew to lift it up and down. It might be worth moving it down before you start the build, just so it's out of the way when you do get to put your graphics card in place. Now the accessories box has lots of different things included in it. As you can see, we've got washers for your SSD mounting. We do have some plastic cable ties, although I didn't really use them. And then you've got these different partitions for the box so that you can section it off nicely. So I've gone ahead and done that, and then just break out all the different screws and put them into the holes there so that you can sort them out and make sure they're all nice and tidy. This makes life a lot easier during the build process if you spend some time doing this beforehand. It's a bit of a faff because you have to go through and sort of sort them out into the different sections, while also paying attention to the manual so you can make sure you've got the right ones and know which screws are for which. And if you want to, you can pause here if you've lost the manual or just need to access the different screw types. And now onto the setup of the power supply unit, which in this case is the Lian Li Edge. This is obviously a Lian Li product and a very nice one. I've done a separate setup and wiring guide on this that I'll link to in the description, because as you will see, it also has a USB hub built into it, which might well be useful depending on what you're doing with your build. But more importantly, it also has easy access ports, and I'm going to show you how to plug in the cables you need for your build if you're following along. First of all, we're going to start with the motherboard power. So this is a 24-pin power cable and 2 EPS power cables for the CPU power. And this is a large 24-pin power connector. On one end, it's split into two parts, and that's the part that plugs into the power supply unit, and then the other end plugs into the motherboard. A quick note again, if you need to, you can skip forward in the video if you already know all this, using the timestamps down below to jump to other points. But these are the 8-pin CPU power connectors, which are clearly marked CPU on one end that plugs into the motherboard and PSU on the other end that plugs into the power supply unit. You'll need both of these sets of cables for most modern motherboards if you want to make the most of them, so I'd recommend plugging them in. I'm going to show you how to do that outside the case now, so it's really easy to see where those plug in, but obviously you'd only plug in the power supply end for now, and then we'll get to the motherboard connections later on. But you're looking for the motherboard 18 plus 10p connections here for the 24-pin power connector first of all. So we need to untie this and then plug it into that port. And this cable obviously is the main power source for your motherboard. So you need to make sure it's fully seated at both ends, plugged all the way into the power supply and all the way into the motherboard. If it isn't, then your machine might not power on. So it's important to note that. But we're pushing that cable in with a little plastic clip. You can only push it in one way on both ends. There's a little clip that pushes into a hole or notches over a port on the motherboard, for example. So you need to make sure it's pushed all the way in and clicks into place at both ends. The 24-pin power cable plugs in on the right-hand side of the motherboard. It's always in the same place. Top right-hand side there, pushes in there until it's fully seated, and you should hear a click, and then you won't be able to get it back out again without first of all lifting the latch on the right hand side. And then obviously we have these cable combs which you can run backwards along the power cables to neaten things up once it's in your build and to make things nice and tidy. These are really handy, but take care with them because you can accidentally make them come apart if you're not gentle, which is obviously be a pain, but you can see that you can run them to various points in there to really neaten those cables up, which can be useful later once we've got it installed in the case. So that's one of the power connectors, and you should make sure that is fully plugged in, as I've said. Next up is the 8-pin CPU power connectors, also known as the EPS cables. They have a CPU marking on one end, which is where it plugs into the motherboard, and then PSU on the other. These are slightly different cables. You'll notice that one, for example, has CPU written on it twice, and it can be split apart. This can be useful if you've got a different motherboard to the one I'm using, because you might have one 8-pin CPU power connector and one 4-pin on the motherboard that needs powering, so you can easily split that cable apart and then plug it in. You'll see that it does slide together, so there's a slight notch on it which slides it in. Most motherboards, in my experience, have two 8-pins, but there is some variety in it, so it's worth watching out when you go about your build which one you have in your system. But I would recommend using both of these. We plug the PSU end into the ports marked CPU and PCIe, find a relevant slot there. I'd recommend on the far right hand side near the 12-volt high power connector rather than the left, as I'm showing you here, and I'll talk about why in a little while. But you need to make sure you've got plenty of length to be able to reach these ports in the case. But they plug in on the top left hand corner of the motherboard, and again you can only plug them in one way because you'll see that there is a little bracket which needs to clip over the very edge of the port, and they're also pinned out in a certain way so they have a shape to them, which is either square or rounded on those various different pins when you look closely. So make sure you plug both of these in, especially if you have a motherboard which is capable of overclocking, or if you want to push your system. But I'd recommend plugging them in anyway. You have the cables, you have the ports, make sure it's all plugged in to make the most of your system, and then you'll end up with these connections to the motherboard eventually once we get there. Next up is the SATA cable, which is used for the hard disk drives, SSDs, your all-in-one cooler, and maybe other things too, like a fan controller, for example. Plugs into the SATA ports on the power supply end, and then you'll see it just connects up to the drives with the other end, which is daisy chainable, so you can connect multiple things to it. Now it has an L-shaped connector to it with a slight notch on there, so you need to make sure you're watching out for that because you can only plug these cables in one way around. But you can plug multiple things into one cable. In this instance, a hard disk drive and an SSD, but two SSDs, and in the end I use two SSDs and the liquid cooler as well. Now you might find if you're using other setups that we want to use the PCIe power cables for something else. So for example, if you're using Lian Li's TL LCD fans, you might need one of these PCIe power connectors. This is generally for graphics cards, but the TL series controller requires this power as well. The end that plugs into the power supply is put into the CPU and PCIe power ports, and then the PCIe end plugs into this adapter for power connections on the TL controller. Now, I'm not actually using it in this build, but I know a lot of people like the TL fans. I've done a separate guide on how to set those up, and that's the essential power connector that you'll need for that if you are planning on putting those fans into your build. Now we're on to graphics cards. This is a 3090, and you can see we've got 4 PCIe power cables included as standard. So if you're using one with TL, you still have 3 spare cables, which you can see here. These are your traditional 8-pin PCIe power connectors, which are split into a 6 and 2 power connector, which needs to be pushed together at the graphics card end. The PSU end is a solid connector, which obviously plugs into the PCIe ports I've just shown you. Now, these cables can be a little bit fiddly, and you need to take care with the PCIe end that you make sure you push those together properly when inserting it into your GPU, because if the part that has 2 connectors on it comes loose, the GPU won't get full power and you might find your performance isn't as good as it should be. So find a spare port marked CPU and PCIe on the power supply unit, and then plug those cables in there. Obviously, you have to work out how many cables you're going to need. In this case, the 3090 has 2 power connectors on it, but if you have 3, then you'll need 3 cables naturally. And then the other end, you just need to make sure you push it together and insert it. Now, obviously, I'm showing you this outside the build just so it's really easy and clear to see, but we'll actually plug these cables in later on if you're going to be installing your GPU and setting it up like this. You want to make sure those cables are pinched together nicely and pushed firmly into the port until they click into place. But you need to make sure both parts of both cables are fully inserted, otherwise you just won't get the performance you should do. And that's that. But as you can see, there's enough cables to plug in more power-hungry GPUs if required. Now, we're using a 4070 Ti here as an alternative. These come with these adapters as standard, the 12-volt high power connector, which plugs into the graphics card on one end and then has several power connectors on the other, either 2, 3, or 4 power connectors, depending on your 40 series graphics card. And then you have to use the 8-pin PCIe power connectors that I've just shown you to plug in the cables to that port. Now, this is a faff, and that adapter is ugly and difficult to manage. And as you'll have seen if you're paying attention at the beginning of the video, I actually don't end up using it. And that's the good thing about this power supply, is that you don't have to. If you want to, you can. You can obviously use all 4 power cables to plug into this adapter, or a 3-port one, depending on what you have included with your GPU. But instead, you want to get rid of all this cabling mess, although you will note there are cable combs on each of the cables. You can instead adapt the 12-volt power cable instead. And that's this cable here, which is marked 600 watts on both ends and has these little blue ports on there. You'll notice that it's the same at both ends and can be plugged in to the power supply and the graphics card, abandoning that adapter and the standard PCIe power cables to neaten up your build and to make life a lot easier. You do need to make sure you fully seat this in, just as you would for the other connector, but you can see the 12-volt high power connector in the far right corner of the power supply ports here. So you plug in one end to that, make sure you push it all the way in so you can't see the blue anymore. You can see that sticking out ever so slightly still, so you need to make sure that's pushed all the way in. And then do the same on the graphics card end. And then that obviously makes life a lot neater and a lot tidier. Obviously, that's all the wiring logic for the power supply. Now plug in all the cables you're going to need, and we're going to go about installing it. You want to install it with the fan facing outwards from the case so that it pulls cold air in and then exhausts out of the rear. We're going to screw it in with the 4 included screws here, which are the hexagonal top screws, to the rear of this cage. Now, it's worth noting you can actually remove this cage at any point if you need to. It's held in place with a few screws there, so you can remove the entire cage if you need to access the back of the motherboard, for example. At this point, I'm also going about tidying these cables up just so they're out of the way for now, and you can make the use of the Velcro ties, or you could just get the whole group of cables and then close the door on it and not have to worry about it. And we'll get to the rest of plugging in everything later on, including the rear connects, because obviously this is a BTF motherboard that we're going to be using. So the power connections I showed you will be slightly different here, but I wanted to show you the standard connections for a standard motherboard as well. So this is a BTF rear connect motherboard, and we're using a WD Black SN850 NVMe SSD for this as well. This is a Gen 4 drive. Now this motherboard and a lot of modern motherboards can actually handle multiple drives. I'm just going to use one for now, and we're going to install it in the top slot. If you're just going to use one drive, I'd recommend, generally speaking, using the top slot on the motherboard because it will usually give you the fastest speeds, and they also have a nice heat shield at the top there. So we have to unscrew it and then remove that, and you'll see there's a sticker underneath we also need to remove in a second. Then you insert the drive into the slot up here. You'll notice there's a little notch on it, and then there's a little plastic latch at the other end which you just need to turn slightly to hold the drive in place. Then remove that sticker over the thermal pad and reseat the heat shield down over the top. Then we're just resecuring it with those screws. It's worth using these heat shields because they actually do help keep the drive cool and running efficiently as well. Next up is the CPU installation. So this is an Intel CPU, and we're using an i9-14900K in this process. Just lift the latch and the lever there, gently seat the CPU down. You'll notice the notches at the bottom that help you line it up, and then carefully put that lid back down and reseat the lever. Now we're going to use some Corsair Dominator RAM in the 2nd and 4th slots. Those are the 2 slots you want to populate to make sure your RAM runs at the right speeds and your system boots properly. So it's A2 and B2. Now for this build, I'm using a Kraken Elite 360 RGB. This is the back plate for that all-in-one cooler, which we need to install on the back of the motherboard. I've got a separate detailed guide on this cooler that I'll link to in the description that you might find useful if you need it. But here I'm going to show you the basic steps for installing it the way I am. So we're putting the back plate on the rear of the motherboard through the holes and lining up the standoffs to come through the other side, because what we're going to do is use this little bag of standoff screws here to secure the cooler to around the edges of the CPU. And you're basically screwing those into the little screw holes that come through from that back plate, and then later on we'll be seating the cooler down over the top of it. Now we're going to install the motherboard into the system, so just gently putting it down over the standoffs that are pre-installed in the case. And then we're going to use 9 screws to secure the motherboard down to those standoffs. So 3 across the bottom, 3 across the middle, 3 across the top. And as a reminder, it's these screws here marked A, as you can see in the manual. And then we're going to go about plugging in the standard cables. So you'll see these white cables, there's a number of them included here. These are for the USB connections on the front of the case, the power button, and for the 3.5mm jack. Run them through some of the cable ties there, and we're going to plug them in. Now, normal motherboard setup, USB-A and USB-C is on the right-hand side with the standard motherboard, so you'd run them through to the front and you'd plug them in near the 24-pin power connector. You can see those 2 cables here and what that might look like. They both only go in one way, so you should find the USB-C one clicks into place when you push it in. And the USB-A, you'll see there's a little plastic notch on it, so you have to line it up with that port and then push it down and seat it fully in there. With the BTF motherboard, things are a little bit different because you'll notice all those connectors are now on the back. They're still near the 24-pin power connector, but they're on the left-hand side instead of the right. Same sort of logic though. So those cables need to be plugged in just below that port. And again, USB-C will only go in one way. So if it doesn't click into place, you need to flip it over and try in the other direction. And then you should find that it sits in there nicely. Can be a little bit fiddly. Even for someone like me that's built plenty of PCs, I still have issues with this every now and then, trying to plug it in. But you get that seated in there, you should feel a click, and then put the USB-A connector in there. And then that's the 2 front panel connections at the bottom of the case sorted out. Then we can use the Velcro ties to tidy these up a bit. You'll notice with the SSD tray removed that we have access to a couple of extra ones that would otherwise be behind that. So if you want to tidy these up and then put the SSD cage back in, you could do. So if you're mounting other SSDs at the rear using those 2 adapters, you can do that. Then we've got the HD audio and the front panel connection, which is 3.5mm jack and the power button. On a standard motherboard, these are plugging on the left-hand side and the right-hand side at the bottom. So the front panel connector goes somewhere down the right-hand side where the F panel markings are. You can see it has a pin missing, so you can only plug it in one way round. And the same for HD audio, which is the 3.5mm jack on the front of the case. That plugs in on the left-hand side. But with a rear connect motherboard, those connections are opposite way round. So once you flip the motherboard over, you'll find the front panel connector on the left-hand side here. And then the HD audio is on the right. Obviously, plugging these in and seeing this is a bit more difficult inside the case because it's dark at the bottom. So hopefully seeing it outside will be helpful. But again, you can only plug it in one way round, so just watch out for that because there are pins missing on both these connectors and where you plug it in. So it's actually pretty straightforward. So just run the cable through towards the HD audio connection on the right-hand side, for example, and then plug it in down there. And that'll allow you to use that front panel connector if you want to. Pretty straightforward. And the nice thing about this is those cables are all hidden away at the rear rather than using a standard motherboard where you'd have to run them through to the front of the case. Taking that into account, obviously you can tidy up the cables a bit more. Now for the power connectors. Now this is where those hooks come in handy. So you can remove those to put the 24-pin power cable underneath, for example. I found that I was running it through this one, sort of making it go down towards the bottom of the case and then back up again, simply because there's an excess of cable here, as you can see. Because we're using a rear connect motherboard, you have more cable at the back to deal with because he's not running any cable through to the front, but that runs up to the left-hand side here. So I showed you earlier on plugging this 24-pin power cable in on the motherboard on the right-hand side on a standard motherboard, but on the rear connect motherboard, it's on the left here, just above the USB-A and USB-C connections that I showed you. You've got to push that all the way in until it clicks into place, and there's a little hook that holds it in place there. It might be a little bit more fiddly because you can't put as much pressure on, obviously, because you're forcing the motherboard from behind, which is not ideal, so just take care there, and then put those brackets back in to neaten the cables up. This is worth doing just because it keeps things out of the way. As you'll see by the end of it, we end up with a lot of cables in here. My cable management isn't perfect, but I wanted to demonstrate how you can put these things in and the various different ties and sections in here that you can use with both a mixture of the Velcro and these metal brackets to be able to sort things out. The two 8-pin CPU power connectors, for example, can run to the top through those Velcro ties, and you can neaten things up there. The cables on this Lian Li Edge power supply unit also have those clips on them as well. So you have the cable combs, which you can also use to neaten things up on those cables if you want to. You don't have to go over the top with cable management here because it's a rear connect motherboard. Most of the things are going to be hidden at the back anyway, so it should be pretty neat. And nothing will really be visible from the front, but plug those two 8-pin CPU power connectors in on the top right here of the motherboard, or on the other side, obviously, if you had an ATX motherboard, it'd be top left, as I've shown already. And then once again, we're just trying to find places where we can tie these down to neaten them up and get them out of the way. As you can see from this case, it's fairly straightforward to do though. You just got a few different loops and ties to deal with and sort out. And then you've got a much neater space. Now I'm using the 12-volt high power cable. Now normally you'd run this through to the front to plug into your graphics card, but in this instance, power connectors are on the motherboard itself. So you can see at the left here, we have a power connector. So the power runs through to the BTF GPU. It's worth noting this is a specific graphics card that's taking power from the motherboard via this connector. But this is another way this motherboard makes life neater and easier in the build. So we can do that now, set that cable up so it's ready for later. Now the next stage is to install the fans on the bottom of the case. So in order to do that, we're going to remove a couple of screws from the front that then releases this tray at the bottom here that we can then pull out. Now I'm going to use some reverse blade Lian Li Infinity fans in this setup. The reverse blade fans allow you to pull air into the case from below, but while still being able to see the blades rather than the back. So we put them with the face up and the back towards the bottom of the tray, and then we screw it in from below. So we secure it with all the fan screws that are included with the accessories box. Then we have to run the cable from that tray of fans back through to the rear, and the underneath you'll see there's a small gap at the bottom there, and then just seat the tray back in with the 3 clips at the bottom, slot it back into place, and then you can screw it in. You'll see from a different angle the 2 little screws, which are the same ones we used to remove all that front panel earlier on. We'll screw those back in and secure that in place there. And then you've got to make sure that cable is nice and neat so it's not visible, and run it through to the rear so it can plug into the Unifan controller, the SL Infinity controller in this instance. And we're going to plug that into port 1, for example, to connect up those 3 fans to this controller. The controller then requires SATA power, so you plug it into the power cable that we use for hard disk drives and SSDs. And there's actually 2 of these connectors on this controller, so we can plug both of those in to make sure that it gets power. And then we're going to run the USB connection through to the USB port on the bottom of the motherboard. On a standard motherboard, this will be on the front middle, but on this rear one, it's on the rear middle. You need to make sure this is plugged in so you can control the fans with L-Connect, and I'll show you the setup for that later on in the video, so stick with me for that. And then just nestle that away for the moment. You can see the cables are already getting a bit messy. Then for the SSD installation, I'm going to use 2 SSDs in this instance and install them on the door that you can see on the left-hand side here. So you need these little rubber washers that you have in the accessories box, and then the SSD screws that you'll see marked in the manual, and you secure them by screwing through the washers into the drives, and then with the door slotted into place, you can then mount the drives on the back of the door by simply slipping them into the large holes and then pushing them over to the right hand side so they're on the smaller part. Make sure that the connectors on the drive are facing downwards into the case if you're putting it at the top, and upwards when you're putting it at the bottom. You'll see why in a second, but it's basically about putting the cables into place and connecting them up to both the power supply and the motherboard. It just makes things neater. So you can see when I put the black one in, I'm putting it with the connectors at the top and slipping it in there. And then we're going to go about putting the connectors on. So basically take your SATA power connector. So if I remove the drive just so you can easily see that, we'll push that in there. Now it's an L-shaped connector, so you can watch out for that when you're trying to install it. It'll only go in one way around. But because this cable is daisy chainable and you can connect multiple things to it, we can take the other end of the cable and connect it up to the other drive that's at the top, and then you've got one cable powering both those drives. Then we need the data cables, which you should find supplied with your motherboard. And we're going to have two cables here. We'll plug one into the top drive and the other one into the bottom drive. Notice the way the silver clip sticks out here. That allows you to release those. And then you run the other ends of the cables down to the bottom of the motherboard, and you're looking for the SATA connections. Now, here you can see them marked SATA 6G and then the number. Plug them into one of those ports, one each for each drive, and then you'll be able to access those when you get into Windows and to install games on them, for example, and other things nice and easily. And then you can shut the door, hide away some of the cables and more. We can then release the radiator tray by unscrewing that thumb screw, as I showed you earlier on, and then pulling the tray out. Now I'm going to install the radiator on this so that the tubes are hidden away at the back, but the fans are visible from the front. You can do a variety of things in this case, but we're going to try and make the most of the design of it by putting the radiator on like this, and then mounting the fans to the other side, securing the rad using the fans, and then running the pump through at the gap at the top of the case to keep things nice and clean. So we can take these fans, and again, these are reverse blade fans. So I'm actually pulling cold air through the radiator from the back of the case, cooling the radiator down, and then giving good CPU cooling. I found this is a good experience, but I'm also going to do a review on this case, thermal testing a bunch of different setups, but this is one of the possibilities. So we use long radiator screws that come with the Kraken cooler to pass through the fans, through the mounting bracket and into the rad. We then secure that down, and then we can take that tray and put it back into the case, obviously with the large part of the back. And then we can take this door off briefly again and then run the pump through to the front. When you do this, you'll notice a few different things. One, this Kraken cooler has quite a chunky design to it because it obviously has that display on it, and that makes it difficult to get through the hole. Also, I've used this before, so it doesn't have any thermal paste on it, but if you've got a brand new one, you might have to take the plastic cap off to get it through that gap, and you might damage the thermal paste while doing so. So it's something to bear in mind. You're going to have to be careful when doing this. Also, you'll see that there's a space to run the tubes underneath the SSD bracket here, and so you want to make sure you neaten those up as much as possible so that you have enough length on the other side. Now on the other side, you can see I've knocked off the rubber housing that would normally sit over here and hide this away. So we're going to put this back on. Again, you can see how tight this is, so you're really probably going to end up wiping thermal paste off with this build, so that's a problem. So you might want to think about buying additional thermal paste instead and cleaning it off before you try and put it through, because this rubber area could also get dirty quite easily based on what I've seen. And then we've got to try and replace that, which is basically just hooks over some of the edging of the case. And it's not too bad, just a little bit fiddly to do. Takes me a bit of time, but it ends up looking really nice. The idea here is basically we're hiding the radiator tubes away at the back of the case to try and make things look a bit neat. This is one of the nice features of the build and of this case. So if you want to be able to do this, this is one of the things. But there are a few caveats. Now, the tubes, because they're mounted at the back, have less length than I would like, and they're a little bit tight. In an ideal world, you would mount the Kraken cooler so that the connections for it run out of the top and the tubes on the right hand side, but you'll see more of that in a second. Instead of using thermal paste, I'm actually using a thermal grizzly Krysosheet here. This is a thermally conductive material which you can put over the CPU when you go to install your all-in-one cooler, and it saves mess because it's just a little sheet. It's quite cool, but you do have to cut it to size. So I've got a specific one that I'll link to in the description that's a bit big, but you can cut a little bit off of it and then it will fit over the CPU. It does warn you about how it's electrically conductive, so you do need to be careful not to have excess on there. So you do need to make sure you got it to the right size of the CPU and take care when installing it. You can see me carefully using some tweezers here, because if you don't and you try and use your fingers, you'll probably end up damaging it. And so it's better just to take care and use some gentle tweezers to do that. And then we can install the pump over the top of the CPU, taking care obviously not to move that sheet while doing so. You'll notice here that I've got the tubes on the right hand side. This isn't optimum because ideally you'd want them on the bottom, but as I said, there's not now enough length, and you'll see why this is a problem in a second. Although it doesn't ruin it, you still can deal with this. Then we want to do the 4 standoffs. So you use the standoff thumb screws that are included with the Kraken cooler and secure it corner to corner, opposite corners. Secure it with your thumbs to start with, and then I'd recommend using a screwdriver just to finish up the tightening and to tighten until they won't tighten anymore, but don't over force it. So just gently screw until they stop screwing, and that will ensure this is secured well and has good contact. And then what I'm trying to do is just to make the tubes look a bit nicer. So you can see there's an excess at the front on one of them, but the other one's a little bit tight. We'll get to more sort of now on the back in a minute. But then we have the cables. So this is a breakout cable that needs to plug into the cooler. Now, usually this would be coming out of the top, but instead, because of the way I've mounted it, I've got to try and neaten these cables up a bit. And I'm trying to run them under the VRM of the motherboard and then up towards the top just so we can hide some of it away. This is the downside from the length of the tubes and the fact that we've mounted the radiator backwards, because it's not normally meant to be mounted like this in a case. But that's the difference with this Vision Compact, is the way you can set it up. But what I ended up doing, ended up making it look pretty nice. I managed to hide some of the wiring underneath the tubes, but you do need to plug that single cable into the CPU fan header, which is on the front of this motherboard. So we plug that in, that's coming out of the pump into that. And then we've got to deal with the other cables at the rear. We have a SATA power connection so that the pump can be powered properly. And then obviously we don't need to use the fan breakout cable from this, but we do need to use the USB connection. So the USB connector plugs into the motherboard, the SATA power to the power supply unit, and then the pump will be powered, and you can control the screen with NZXT's CAM software. Then there's a little bit more cable tidying to do to try and neaten that up so those cables are a bit tidier. And then I actually ended up using some Velcro ties just to try and get the tubes from that AIO to look a bit neater. I figured that if I could tidy them up at the rear, tighten them together, maybe it would make it look a bit cleaner at the front, and this actually does work in some ways, as you'll see. So I just wanted to do that, and also to try and hide away more of that cable from the breakout cable, so we can tuck that away at the back as well. And then putting the SSD tray back on and securing that, making sure the cables, if they came loose, that they're re-secured. And then we're going to the front. Now, one thing I forgot to do, hopefully you didn't, is to plug the cables into the fans on the radiator. Now you can see I had to remove the bottom fan tray in order to access the bottom of the fans to be able to do this. So it's one thing to think about during this build process. And then run the cables from those fans through to the rear, and then reseat the bottom fans and secure those again. It's a little bit fiddly to be able to reach the bottom of the fans on the radiator to be able to do what I just did without first removing this tray. But that's one of the benefits of this case and this design, is that you can take that tray in and out fairly easily. Now with the cabling from the rad fans, we're going to run it to the controller. Now just make sure you remember which port you're plugging it into. In this instance, I'm using port 3. When we go to L-Connect later on, you want to then be able to adjust the fans specifically that are on the rad to account for the CPU temperature, so they can adjust and speed up when the CPU gets a bit hot. But we'll talk about that a bit later on. Now I'm using 2 standard blade Infinity fans mounted at the rear. These are 120mm fans, as they are throughout. But these ones are mounted at the back, and they're going to be our exhaust fans. So we've got 6 intake fans and 2 exhaust. We're going to have a lot more cool air flowing through than exhausting out, but the hope is good cooling, and during my testing I can tell you that it does perform well and looks good too in this setup. We'll use the included screws from the accessories box to secure these to the case. Note you can use the screws that come with the fans, but these silver screws are really nice and look nice with the case, so I just prefer to use the ones that come with the accessories box. And then plug that into one of the spare ports on the controller as well. And then that's set up too, so they're all wired in now. We have 3 groups of fans plugged into the controller and set up and ready to go, so that's fairly straightforward. And then we can just close the SSD tray, put the door back on at the rear, and everything's nice and shut away there. As you can see, the front's looking really clean. Now for the graphics card installation, remove the 2 brackets next to the PCIe X16 slot, and then we're going to slot this GPU into that top slot. Now you do this with any graphics card, but obviously on this motherboard, this is important because the power connector for this one is around there as well. So this is how it will get power, so you won't need the additional power cables that I showed you earlier on. If you're using a standard motherboard, you want to run your power cables from the rear and plug that in. Don't forget that we also have the anti-sag bracket below that, so you can run that up, tighten it up, and secure your GPU in that position. And then we'll turn it on and see that everything's working properly, apart from the screen, which obviously the display is the wrong way around, but don't worry because we can rotate that in NZXT's CAM software. Put the glass door back on by putting the feet in at the bottom, pushing it back in, and then securing it with that thumb screw, and then re-secure the glass at the top as well. You'll notice I've already put the glass front back on, so you just follow the instructions from the beginning to put that back in first, and then secure everything up, and then you'll end up with a build that hopefully looks something like this. Now, I'm pretty happy with how this has come out. It looks really clean, as you can see. You can only really see the one cable connected to the CPU header and there, sort of tubes running through to the rear. I've mostly hidden away the rest of the cables really neatly. I think it ends up looking really clean in this build. Hopefully you like it as well. And this is the style I wanted to go for. But I'm also going to do some other videos on this case, including a review, but maybe some other build guides. So if you'd like to see some of the other setups, let me know in the comments down below. But in a second, I'm going to show you how to install Windows and then what you need to do with Lian Li's L-Connect software so that you can get the fan set up properly to manage your temperatures okay. So stick with me to see that. And then on to setting up Windows. So on a separate PC, search for the Windows Media Creation tool. And we're going to download the latest update for Windows 11 and install that. So there's a Windows Media Creation tool here, which you'll need a USB drive for. I've shown how to do this on your phone if you don't have a spare PC. I'll link to that video. And then you can just basically go through the process, use this creation tool to install it on a drive that's external, and then you'll be able to plug it into your new PC that you're building and install Windows. So you have to wait a little bit of time for this to happen. But once it's complete, you want to take the drive that you've installed it onto, plug it into the back of your motherboard, and then turn the PC on. You should find that it then automatically recognizes there's a Windows creation drive plugged in. And then when it starts through the boot process, it should take you into the tool for installing Windows. You'll then need to follow the on-screen prompts to install the Windows relevant to your location. I'm obviously going for United Kingdom because that's time and format, and also the keyboard method, but you might want to choose other ones. Apologies for some of the focus on some of these clips, it went a bit wrong, but basically you want to go through the steps here. If you have a product key, enter it. If you don't, just click I don't have one. You can do that later on. Then Windows 11 Home, and then the installation for that, and just keep clicking through. We want to do custom install, so install Windows only. Click on that and then select the drive that we're using. Click new to create the relevant partition on that and set it up. And then just keep clicking next, go through and start installing Windows. Now, we'll take some time to do this. And obviously we also need to make sure we get the updates once we get into there. But you go through, click that, and then wait, be patient. And then what you will find is eventually, once it gets to the part where it's about to finish, you'll need to unplug the USB drive that you plugged in for when it reboots. Otherwise, it will try and use this again. So just once you get to the end of the process here, when it says it's about to restart, just keep an eye on it. Because when it goes through that restart process, as you can see, the bar's filling up here, take that drive out and then allow it to reboot, and it should just reboot into the final stages of the Windows installation without the need for that drive. Once you're in Windows properly, you'll want to download both L-Connect and NZXT's CAM software. CAM's going to be used to control the display on the Kraken cooler, and as you can see, it gives you monitoring and lighting options. And we go into the LCD display. I personally like to set it to dual infographic, or maybe dual infographic plus GIF. So you can choose an image and then you can select like your temperature readouts for the CPU and GPU and set up some colors for it and personalize that. And then you can easily see those temps at a glance. Under the cooling section, you can also adjust the pump. So you can see it's currently set to silent, and that's based on the liquid temperature. But from the drop down there, you could set it to the CPU, for example, and then adjust in there to maybe be silent or performance mode or whatever you prefer. But the fan controls are obviously in L-Connect because we're using Infinity fans on the radiator. So in L-Connect 3, you want to go to the fan pump profile, and then you can see the 3 ports that we've got connected and the RPMs the fans are currently running at. As a reminder, port 3 was the one on the fans on the radiator. So we select that, and then you can see from the drop-down down here that it's set to change based on the CPU temperature. We could maybe set them all to quiet, standard or high speed, depending on what you want. I personally prefer quiet, and that'll adjust all the fans there. But if we tweak the ones on port 1 and 2 to adjust based on the GPU temperature, you've then got 3 fans accounting for the CPU temp and then the rest for the GPU, and they'll adjust accordingly based on this fan curve at the bottom. To change the lighting, you then go to the SL-Infinity utility section over the left-hand side here, and you can choose from a variety of different effects. Now I've got it set to static color because I like mine in blue, but you can choose from other ones and adjust the brightness and all the other things in here really easily. Hopefully this has given you some useful insights into how to build this case and what to do to make it looking good and setting it up nicely. If you found it useful, let me know in the comments down below. And if you think I've missed anything, please let me know too. And don't forget to check out the links in the description to more related videos that you might also find useful. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.